I'm 89 years old now, sitting in my worn leather chair with a photograph trembling in my weathered hands. It's faded, yellowed at the edges, taken in 1944. In it, I see a young man I barely recognize anymore, standing next to Jimmy O'Sullivan with that cocky grin of his. But what gets me every time I look at this picture isn't the youth in our faces or the mud on our uniforms. It's remembering the sound. That deafening roar of Jimmy's Thompson submachine gun, spitting fire and death at an enemy that never saw us coming. I've never told this story to anyone. Not to my wife of 60 years, God rest her soul. Not to my children or grandchildren. Hell, I've barely admitted it to myself. But sitting here now, feeling the weight of all these years pressing down on my chest like a stone, I know it's time. Time to tell you about those 30 seconds that changed everything. 30 seconds that didn't just help win a war, but transformed a scared Brooklyn kid into someone I'm still trying to understand. It was June 6th, 1944. 5:47 in the morning, Normandy, France. The smell of gunpowder mixed with salt air burned my nostrils as I crouched beside Jimmy in that godforsaken crater, my hands slick with sweat as I fed ammunition into his Thompson. The Germans were dug in good, real good, in a concrete bunker about 50 yards ahead of us. They had a clear field of fire across the beach, and they were using it. Bodies of American boys floated in the surf behind us. The water turned red with their blood. Jimmy was firing in controlled bursts, just like they taught us in training. But this wasn't training. This was hell on earth, and we were right in the middle of it. Every time he squeezed that trigger, I could feel the vibration through the ground, through my bones. The brass casings were piling up around us, hot metal singing as they hit the rocks. And through it all, Jimmy kept talking to me, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Feed me another clip, Danny boy," he'd say, never taking his eyes off the target. "These krauts think they got us pinned, but they don't know what's coming." I was 19 years old, and I'd never killed anyone in my life. 3 months earlier, I was working in my father's auto repair shop in Brooklyn, getting grease under my fingernails and dreaming about taking Maria Rossetti to the pictures on Saturday night. Now here I was, crammed into a bomb crater on a French beach, watching my best friend mow down German soldiers like wheat in a field. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand how I got there, how a kid from Bensonhurst ended up beside the best soldier I ever knew, watching him do what he was born to do. Because that moment, those 30 seconds when everything changed, they didn't happen in a vacuum. They were the culmination of a journey that started long before I ever heard the word Normandy. It was 1943 when I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I was 18, fresh out of high school, working for my old man in his garage on 86th Street. Every morning, I'd wake up to the smell of my mother's coffee and the sound of the radio crackling with news from overseas. The war was everywhere. In every conversation, every newspaper headline, every worried look on my parents' faces when they thought I wasn't watching. My father, Salvatore Benedetto, had come to America from Sicily when he was just 16. He'd worked his fingers to the bone to build something for his family, and that garage was his pride and joy. Grease-stained and cluttered maybe, but it was ours. He'd look at me sometimes while I was bent over an engine, and I could see the hope in his eyes. He wanted me to take over someday, to carry on what he'd built, but I had other ideas. See, being Italian in Brooklyn in 1943 wasn't always easy. We'd been Americans for a generation, but some people still looked at us sideways, especially with Mussolini allied with Hitler. I'd hear the whispers sometimes, see the suspicious glances when I'd walk down the street. It ate at me, that doubt about where my loyalties lay. I was as American as apple pie, born right here in Brooklyn, but I felt like I had to prove it. The day I walked into the Army recruitment office on Court Street, I wasn't thinking about glory or adventure. I was thinking about proving that Salvatore Benedetto's son was ready to bleed for the red, white and blue. The recruiter, a grizzled sergeant with kind eyes, looked me up and down and asked why I wanted to enlist. "Because this is my country," I told him, "and I'm ready to fight for it." He smiled and handed me the papers. My mother cried for 3 days straight when I told them. My father, he just nodded slowly and shook my hand like I was already a man. "You do what you think is right, Daniel," he said in that thick accent he never quite lost. "But you come home to us, you understand? You come home." Maria took it the hardest. We'd been talking about getting engaged after I saved up enough for a ring. She was beautiful, with dark hair that caught the light just right and eyes that could make you forget your own name. The night before I shipped out, we walked along the promenade in Brooklyn Heights, looking out at the Manhattan skyline all lit up despite the war. "Promise me you'll come back," she whispered, her hand tight in mine. "I promise," I said, meaning every word. "I'll come back and we'll get married and I'll take over my father's shop and we'll have 12 kids. She laughed through her tears. "12? You're crazy, Danny Benedetto." Maybe I was. But sitting here now, remembering that night, I can still feel the certainty I had then, the absolute conviction that I'd keep that promise, that the war was just something I had to get through before my real life could begin. Basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, was like nothing I'd ever experienced. They broke us down and built us back up, turned a bunch of city kids and farm boys into something resembling soldiers. I was good with my hands, steady under pressure, so they made me an assistant machine gunner. My job was to feed ammunition, carry extra barrels, and keep my gunner alive. That's where I met Jimmy O'Sullivan. Jimmy was from South Boston, Irish as a shamrock and twice as stubborn. He had red hair that stuck up in all directions, freckles across his nose, and the quickest smile I'd ever seen. He was also the best natural soldier in our entire company. Give Jimmy a Thompson submachine gun, and he could put bullets exactly where he wanted them every single time. We clicked right away, Jimmy and me. Maybe it was because we were both city kids in a company full of farm boys from Alabama and Mississippi. Maybe it was because we both had something to prove. Whatever it was, by the time we shipped out for England, we were inseparable. "You stick with me, Danny boy," Jimmy would say, cleaning his Thompson with the devotion of a priest tending his altar. "I'll keep you alive, and you keep me fed with ammo. We'll both go home heroes." The crossing to England was rough. 30 days on a troop transport, packed in like sardines, most of us seasick as dogs. Jimmy never got sick, though. He'd stand on deck in the worst weather, letting the spray hit his face, grinning like a maniac. "Look at that ocean, Danny," he'd say. "My grandfather crossed this same water when he came to America, except he was running from the English, and here we are, going to help them." In England, we trained for the invasion everyone knew was coming. We practiced beach landings, street fighting, everything they thought we'd need. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared us for what we found waiting on that beach in Normandy. The night before D-Day, Jimmy and I sat on our bunks, writing letters we hoped we'd never have to send. The whole camp was quiet, that heavy kind of silence that comes before something big and terrible. Jimmy kept looking at a photograph, a picture of a young woman with dark hair and a sweet smile. "That's my sister, Kathleen," he said, showing me the picture. "She's all the family I got left. Parents died in the influenza epidemic when I was 12. I looked at the photo. Kathleen O'Sullivan had Jimmy's eyes, bright blue and full of life. "She's beautiful," I said. "She's everything to me," Jimmy replied, tucking the photo back into his shirt pocket. "If something happens to me over there, Danny, I want you to tell her I was thinking about her at the end. Can you do that for me?" "Nothing's going to happen to you," I said. "We're going to get through this, and you're going to go home and dance at her wedding." Jimmy smiled, but there was something in his eyes, something that made my stomach clench. "Maybe, but promise me anyway. Promise me you'll tell her." "I promise," I said, not knowing that I was making a vow that would haunt me for the next 75 years. At 4 in the morning, they woke us up. "This is it, boys," our sergeant called out. "Today we take the beach." The landing craft pitched and rolled like a cork in a bathtub as we approached Omaha Beach. 36 men crammed into that metal box, most of them green around the gills from seasickness and fear. The smell was overwhelming: diesel fuel, vomit, sweat, and something else I couldn't identify then, but know now was pure terror. Jimmy sat across from me, his Thompson cradled in his arms like a baby, his face pale but determined. I could hear the naval bombardment pounding the beach ahead of us, our big guns trying to soften up the German defenses. The sound was like thunder that never stopped, rolling across the water and vibrating through the hull of our landing craft. Some of the guys were praying, others just staring at nothing. A kid from Tennessee named Bobby was crying quietly, trying to hide it from the rest of us. "Hey, Bobby!" Jimmy called out over the noise. "You know what we're going to do when we get home? We're going to find the prettiest girls in America and dance until our feet fall off." Bobby managed a weak smile. That was Jimmy for you, always trying to keep everyone's spirits up, even when his own hands were shaking. The coxswain shouted back at us, "2 minutes! Check your gear!" I ran through my equipment one more time. Extra ammunition for Jimmy's Thompson, my own M1 Garand, grenades, first aid kit, the letter from my mother, tucked into my breast pocket. Everything was there, everything was ready, but I wasn't ready. Nobody could be ready for what we were about to see. The ramp dropped with a metallic clang, and suddenly we were looking at hell itself. The beach stretched out in front of us, maybe 200 yards of open sand between us and the seawall, and every inch of it was covered in machine gun fire from the German positions on the bluffs above. Bodies floated in the surf, boys who'd been in landing crafts just like ours, who'd made this same run minutes before us. "Go, go, go!" the sergeant screamed, and we poured out of that boat like water from a broken dam. I hit the water up to my waist, the cold Atlantic shocking my system. The weight of my gear tried to drag me down, but I fought my way forward, following Jimmy toward the beach. All around us, bullets were hitting the water with little splashes, like deadly raindrops. To my left, I saw a boy from Chicago take a round in the chest and disappear beneath the waves. Jimmy was moving like a man possessed, his Thompson already firing short bursts at the German positions. "Stay with me, Danny," he shouted over the noise. "Don't stop moving." I don't remember much about that run across the beach. It was like a nightmare where your legs won't work right, and everything happens in slow motion. I saw muzzle flashes from the German bunkers, heard the whine of bullets passing close to my head, felt the sand kick up around my feet as machine gun rounds chewed up the beach. Somehow, by some miracle, we made it to a shell crater about halfway to the seawall. Jimmy dove in first, and I tumbled in after him. For a moment we just lay there, breathing hard, trying to process what we'd just survived. The crater was maybe 6 feet across and 3 feet deep, barely enough to hide us from the German gunners. But it was cover, and right then, cover was everything. "Jesus Christ," I gasped, checking myself for wounds. "How are we still alive?" "Because we're too stupid to die," Jimmy replied, already scanning the German positions through the smoke. "Look there, Danny. See that bunker with the machine gun? That's what's keeping our boys pinned down." I followed his gaze and saw it, a concrete emplacement maybe 50 yards away, with a German MG-42 machine gun poking out of a firing slit. As I watched, it opened up again, spraying death across the beach. More American boys fell, cut down before they could even get close to cover. "We have to take it out," Jimmy said, his voice calm despite the chaos around us. "If we don't, nobody's getting off this beach alive." "How?" I asked. "It's 50 yards of open ground. We'll never make it." Jimmy was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something I'd never seen before. A sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Danny, I need you to promise me something. If I don't make it out of this, I need you to deliver this letter." "What letter? Jimmy, what are you talking about?" "It's for someone back home, someone important. Promise me, Danny, no matter what happens, you'll make sure this gets delivered." The way he said it, the look in his eyes, it scared me more than all the German machine guns on that beach. "Jimmy, you're going to deliver it yourself. We're both getting out of here." "Promise me," he insisted, grabbing my arm. "Swear to me you'll deliver this letter." "I promise," I said, taking the envelope with shaking hands. "But you're going to be fine. We're both going to be fine." Jimmy smiled, that cocky grin of his. "That's the spirit, Danny boy. Now here's what we're going to do. I'm going to circle around to the right, draw their fire. When they're focused on me, you take this ammunition and work your way up the left side. When you're in position, you signal me, and we hit them from both sides." It was a crazy plan. Suicidal, really. But it was the only chance we had, and Jimmy knew it. I knew it too, even if I didn't want to admit it. "Ready?" he asked, checking his Thompson one last time. I nodded, though I wasn't ready. I don't think anyone could ever be ready for what we were about to do. Jimmy took off like a sprinter, running in a crouch toward the right side of the German position. Almost immediately the machine gun swung toward him, spitting fire. I could see the tracers cutting through the air, missing him by inches. But Jimmy kept moving, diving from crater to crater, drawing their attention away from me. I went left, crawling on my belly through the sand and debris, dragging the extra ammunition behind me. Every few seconds I'd hear Jimmy's Thompson chattering, short controlled bursts aimed at the bunker. He was keeping them busy, giving me the chance I needed to get into position. It took me what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, to work my way around to the left side of the German position. From there, I could see into the bunker through a gap in the concrete. 3 German soldiers, all focused on Jimmy's position. They had no idea I was there. I signaled to Jimmy, waving my helmet above the crater I was hiding in. He saw me and nodded. Then he did something that still gives me chills when I think about it. He stood up, completely exposed, and charged straight at that bunker, his Thompson firing full automatic. The Germans swung their machine gun toward him, and that's when I opened fire. My M1 Garand cracked 8 times in rapid succession, and all 3 German soldiers went down. Jimmy reached the bunker a few seconds later, tossing a grenade through the firing slit to make sure. The explosion echoed across the beach, and suddenly that section of Omaha was quiet. The machine gun that had been cutting down American boys all morning was silent forever. Jimmy turned toward me, that grin spreading across his face. "We did it, Danny boy. We actually did it." That's when the sniper's bullet took him. I heard the crack of the rifle from somewhere up on the bluffs, saw Jimmy's body jerk as the round punched through his chest. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his uniform with an expression of surprise, like he couldn't quite believe what was happening. "Danny," he called out, his voice already getting weak. "Danny, I think I'm hit." I ran to him, forgetting about cover, forgetting about the sniper, forgetting about everything except my best friend bleeding out in the sand. I caught him as he fell, his blood warm and sticky on my hands. "The letter," he whispered, his eyes already starting to glaze over. "You promised, Danny. You promised you'd deliver the letter." "I will," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I promise, Jimmy. I'll deliver it." He smiled one last time, that cocky Irish grin that had gotten us through basic training and across the Atlantic. "Tell Kathleen. Tell her I was thinking about her." And then he was gone. I held him there in the sand for I don't know how long, my best friend's blood soaking into my uniform. Around us, the battle for Omaha Beach continued, but for me, the war had suddenly become very personal. The Germans had taken Jimmy O'Sullivan from me, and I was going to make them pay. I found the sniper about an hour later, hidden in a church steeple about 300 yards inland. I put a bullet through his head with Jimmy's Thompson, and I felt nothing, No satisfaction, no revenge, just emptiness. Jimmy was still dead, and killing his murderer didn't bring him back. I stayed with Jimmy's body until another unit found me late that afternoon. By then, the beach was secure, and medics were moving among the wounded and the dead. I'd been sitting there for hours, just holding my best friend, watching the blood dry on his uniform. The letter he'd given me was tucked safely in my breast pocket, right next to the one from my mother. 2 pieces of paper that suddenly felt heavier than all the ammunition I'd carried that day. The sergeant who found me was older, maybe 35, with kind eyes and a gentle voice. "Come on, son," he said, kneeling down beside me. "There's nothing more you can do for him now." I looked up at him, and I must have been a sight, covered in Jimmy's blood, my face streaked with tears and sand, probably looking like I'd aged 10 years in one day. "He was my best friend," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I know," the sergeant replied. "But he wouldn't want you sitting here when there's still work to do. Help me get his tags and personal effects. We'll make sure he gets home proper." That's when I made my first mistake. When the sergeant asked me to list Jimmy's personal effects, I didn't mention the letter. I told him about the photograph of Kathleen, his rosary beads, his wallet with $3 and a subway token from Boston, but I kept quiet about that sealed envelope burning a hole in my pocket. I told myself I was protecting Jimmy's privacy, that whatever was in that letter was meant for whoever he'd addressed it to. But the truth was, I was scared. Scared of what I might find inside, scared of the responsibility he'd placed on my shoulders. The next few weeks passed in a blur of combat and exhaustion. We pushed inland, fighting through the hedgerows of Normandy, taking towns with names I couldn't pronounce. Every night, I'd pull out that letter and stare at it by candlelight or moonlight, trying to work up the courage to open it. But I never did. Jimmy had trusted me to deliver it, not to read it, and I was going to honor that trust. The problem was, I had no idea who to deliver it to. The envelope was addressed simply to K.O. in Jimmy's careful handwriting. No last name, no address, nothing that would help me figure out who this mysterious person was. I assumed it was for Kathleen, his sister, but something about the way he'd acted when he gave it to me suggested it might be someone else entirely. I started having nightmares about Jimmy. He'd appear to me in my dreams, standing in that crater on Omaha Beach, asking me about the letter. "Did you deliver it, Danny boy?" he'd ask, that familiar grin on his face. "You promised you'd deliver it." "I will," I'd tell him. "As soon as I get home, I'll find Kathleen and give it to her." But Jimmy would shake his head. "You don't understand, Danny. It's not for Kathleen. It's for someone else, someone special. You have to find her, Danny. You have to keep your promise." Yai. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the letter clutched in my hand. The other guys in my unit started to worry about me. I wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating much, and I'd developed a nervous habit of checking my breast pocket every few minutes to make sure the letter was still there. "You okay, Benedetto?" my new squad leader asked me one day as we were setting up camp outside a bombed-out French village. "You seem a little jumpy lately." "I'm fine, Sarge," I lied. "Just tired." But I wasn't fine. The weight of that promise was eating me alive. Every day that passed, every mile we marched away from Omaha Beach, felt like I was failing Jimmy all over again. I'd saved his letter, but what good was that if I couldn't deliver it? The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. VE Day, they called it. Victory in Europe. I was in a displaced persons camp in Germany when we got the news, helping to process refugees and former prisoners of war. All around me, people were celebrating, crying with joy, embracing strangers. The nightmare was finally over. But I felt nothing. While everyone else was thinking about going home, about reuniting with their families, all I could think about was that letter and the promise I'd made to a dead man. How was I supposed to celebrate when I'd failed my best friend? I wrote to Jimmy's sister Kathleen before I shipped home, a carefully worded letter expressing my condolences and telling her how brave her brother had been. I described his final moments in the most gentle terms I could manage, leaving out the worst details, but making sure she knew he'd been thinking of her at the end. I didn't mention the letter. Something told me it wasn't meant for her, and until I knew for sure, I was going to keep it to myself. The ship that brought me back to New York Harbor was packed with soldiers, all of us eager to get home and start our lives over. But as I stood on deck, watching the Statue of Liberty grow larger on the horizon, I felt like a fraud. Everyone else was coming home a hero. I was coming home with a secret that was slowly destroying me from the inside. My family was waiting for me at the dock. My mother, my father, my younger sister Anna, and Maria. Beautiful Maria, who'd waited for me just like she'd promised. She ran into my arms, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. For a moment, I could almost forget about the war and the letter and the promise I'd made. "Welcome home, Danny," she whispered in my ear. "I knew you'd keep your promise." If only she knew about the other promise I'd made, the one I was already breaking. The first few months back in Brooklyn were the hardest. Everyone wanted to hear war stories, wanted to know what it was like over there. I'd tell them sanitized versions of the truth, leaving out the blood and the fear and the way Jimmy's eyes had looked when the life went out of them. I became an expert at changing the subject, at deflecting questions about combat with jokes or comments about the food or the weather in Europe. Maria and I got married in the fall of 1945, a small ceremony at St. Bartholomew's, with both our families in attendance. She was radiant in her white dress, and I tried to be the happy groom everyone expected me to be. But even on my wedding day, I could feel the weight of that letter in my jacket pocket. I'd taken to carrying it everywhere, like a talisman or a curse. On our honeymoon night, Maria noticed something was wrong. "You seem different, Danny," she said as we lay in bed in the little hotel room we'd rented in the Catskills. "Distant. Are you thinking about the war?" "No," I lied. "I'm just tired. It's been a long day." But she was right. I was different. The war had changed me, and not just in the obvious ways. I'd seen things, done things that had left scars on my soul, and carrying Jimmy's secret was like pouring salt on those wounds every single day. I went to work for my father in the garage, just like we'd planned before the war. The work was familiar, comforting in its way. There's something honest about fixing engines, about taking something broken and making it work again. I threw myself into it, working long hours, staying late to avoid going home and facing Maria's worried looks. She was pregnant by Christmas, and I should have been over the moon. We were going to have a baby, start a family, build the life we'd dreamed about during those long nights when I was overseas. But instead of joy, all I felt was guilt. How could I be a good father when I couldn't even keep a simple promise to my dead friend? Our son Michael was born in September of 1946, a healthy baby boy with Maria's dark eyes and my stubborn chin. Holding him for the first time, feeling his tiny fingers wrap around mine, I made a silent vow that I would be a better man for him. I would find a way to deliver Jimmy's letter, to honor the promise I'd made, and then I could finally put the war behind me and focus on my family. But weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, and still that letter remained undelivered. I'd made half-hearted attempts to track down Jimmy's family in Boston, but every lead turned into a dead end. The O'Sullivans had moved away after the war, scattered to the winds, like so many other families trying to start fresh in peacetime America. By 1950, we had 3 children, Michael, followed by daughters Catherine and Rose. I was a successful businessman, having expanded my father's garage into a small chain of auto repair shops across Brooklyn. From the outside, I had everything a man could want: a beautiful wife, healthy children, financial security, the respect of my community. But inside, I was dying a little more each day. The letter had become an obsession, a constant reminder of my failure. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, Jimmy's voice echoing in my ears. "You promised, Danny boy. You promised you'd deliver the letter." I started drinking to quiet the voices in my head. Just a beer or two after work at first, then a few shots of whiskey before bed to help me sleep. Maria noticed, of course. She always noticed everything. "Danny, you're scaring me," she said one night, after I'd come home particularly late and particularly drunk. "What's wrong? What happened to you over there?" I wanted to tell her everything, about Jimmy, about the letter, about the promise that was eating me alive. But the words wouldn't come. How could I explain that I was haunted by a piece of paper, by a dead man's final request that I'd failed to fulfill? "Nothing's wrong," I said, the lie bitter on my tongue. "I'm just tired. Business is stressful." But Maria wasn't fooled. She was too smart, too perceptive, and she loved me too much to let me destroy myself without a fight. She started asking more questions, pushing harder for answers I couldn't give. Our marriage began to strain under the weight of my secret, and I watched helplessly as the distance between us grew wider every day. The children suffered too. I was there physically, but emotionally I was still on that beach in Normandy, still holding Jimmy's dying body, still carrying the burden of a promise I couldn't keep. I missed school plays and baseball games, birthday parties and family dinners. I was becoming a stranger in my own home, and I hated myself for it. By the 1960s, I had become a master at living a double life. To everyone around me, I was Danny Benedetto, successful businessman, devoted family man, pillar of the community. I served on the parish council at St. Bartholomew's, coached Little League Baseball, donated generously to local charities. But underneath that carefully constructed facade, I was slowly drowning in guilt and self-loathing. The letter had become my constant companion, more familiar to me than my own reflection. I'd moved it from hiding place to hiding place over the years, first in my dresser drawer, then in a safety deposit box at the bank, finally settling on a small wooden box I kept hidden in the attic. Every few months, I'd climb those creaky stairs and take it out, holding it up to the light, wondering for the 1,000th time what secrets it contained. Maria and I were barely speaking by then. Oh, we maintained the pretense of a happy marriage in public, but at home we moved around each other like polite strangers. She'd given up asking me what was wrong, tired of being met with silence and lies. Our children, now teenagers, had learned to navigate around their father's moods, walking on eggshells whenever I was in the room. The breaking point came in 1968, on the 24th anniversary of D-Day. I'd been drinking heavily that night, sitting alone in my study, staring at Jimmy's photograph and feeling sorry for myself. Maria found me there at 2 a.m, passed out in my chair with an empty bottle of bourbon on the floor beside me. "That's it," she said, her voice cold and final. "I can't do this anymore, Danny. I can't watch you destroy yourself and take our family down with you." And I looked up at her through bleary eyes, this woman who'd loved me unconditionally for over 20 years and saw something I'd never seen before. Resignation. She was done fighting for us, done trying to save a marriage to a man who was already dead inside. "Maria, please," I started, but she held up her hand to stop me. "No more excuses, Danny. No more lies. Either you get help, real help, or I'm taking the children and leaving. I won't let them watch their father drink himself to death." The ultimatum hit me like a physical blow. The thought of losing my family, of being completely alone with my guilt and my secrets, was more terrifying than anything I'd faced in the war. For the first time in 24 years, I seriously considered telling Maria everything, about Jimmy, about the letter, about the promise that had been slowly killing me from the inside. But I couldn't do it. The shame was too deep, the fear too strong. Instead, I made another promise I wasn't sure I could keep. "I'll get help," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'll stop drinking. I'll be better." Maria studied my face for a long moment, searching for any sign that I meant it. Finally, she nodded. "You have one chance, Danny. One. Don't waste it." I did stop drinking, cold turkey, and it nearly killed me. The withdrawal was brutal, shaking hands, cold sweats, hallucinations that had me seeing Jimmy's ghost in every shadow. But somehow, I made it through. I threw myself into work with renewed vigor, expanded the business, tried to be the husband and father my family deserved. For a while, it worked. Maria and I began talking again, really talking, about everything except the one thing that mattered most. The children started to relax around me, and I even managed to attend a few of their school events without feeling like I was going to crawl out of my skin. But the letter was still there, still waiting, still demanding to be delivered. And as the years passed, my guilt only grew stronger. I was in my 50s now, and Jimmy had been dead for over 30 years. How many people had I failed by keeping his secret? How many lives had been affected by my cowardice? In 1975, I finally worked up the courage to make a real effort to find Jimmy's family. I hired a private investigator, a former cop named Tony Rizzo, who specialized in tracking down missing persons. I told him I was trying to locate the family of a war buddy who died in France, that I had some personal effects to return. Tony worked the case for 6 months, following every lead, checking every record. What he found broke my heart all over again. Kathleen O'Sullivan had died in 1965, just 10 years earlier, from cancer. She'd never married, never had children, had spent her life working as a nurse in Boston. She died alone in a charity hospital, with no one to claim her body except a distant cousin who'd barely known her. "I'm sorry, Mr. Benedetto," Tony said when he delivered the news. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but if it helps, I found out she kept a scrapbook about her brother, newspaper clippings about his unit, letters from his commanding officers, that sort of thing. She never forgot him." The news hit me like a sledgehammer. Kathleen was dead, and with her had died any chance of delivering Jimmy's letter to his family. I'd failed him completely, and now it was too late to make it right. That night I climbed up to the attic and held that letter for hours, crying like I hadn't cried since the day Jimmy died. But Tony's investigation had turned up one more piece of information, a detail that would change everything. Kathleen had a niece, Catherine O'Sullivan Murphy, who lived in Boston with her husband and 2 children. She was Kathleen's brother Patrick's daughter, which made her Jimmy's niece as well. I stared at the address Tony had given me, my hands shaking. Here was a chance, maybe my last chance, to honor the promise I'd made to Jimmy. But what would I say to this woman? How could I explain why I'd waited 31 years to contact her family? How could I tell her about an uncle she might not even remember? I put the address in my wallet and carried it with me for months, taking it out dozens of times, reaching for the phone, then losing my nerve at the last minute. What if she didn't want to hear from me? What if the letter contained something that would hurt her or her family? What if I was just being selfish, trying to ease my own guilt at the expense of innocent people? The decision was made for me in the spring of 1976, when I had my first heart attack. I was 53 years old, supposedly in the prime of my life, but the stress and guilt of carrying Jimmy's secret for over 3 decades had taken its toll. I collapsed in the garage one Tuesday morning, and if it hadn't been for my foreman finding me quickly, I would have died right there on the shop floor. Lying in that hospital bed, with Maria holding my hand and my children gathered around me, I realized how close I'd come to taking Jimmy's secret to my grave. The thought terrified me more than the prospect of dying. If I died without delivering that letter, I'd be failing Jimmy for all eternity. That's when I finally told Maria everything. She listened without interruption as I poured out the whole story: Jimmy's death, the letter, the promise I'd made, the decades of guilt and shame that had nearly destroyed our marriage. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, just holding my hand and staring out the hospital window. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she finally asked, her voice soft and sad. "I was ashamed," I admitted. "I was supposed to be a hero, a war veteran who'd done his duty. How could I tell you I'd failed the most important promise I'd ever made?" Maria squeezed my hand. "Oh, Danny, you've been carrying this burden alone for 32 years. No wonder you were drinking. No wonder you were so distant." "I don't know what to do," I said, feeling like that scared 19-year-old kid again. "Kathleen's dead. I waited too long, and now it's too late." "Maybe not," Maria said, reaching into her purse and pulling out the address I'd shown her. "This Catherine woman, Jimmy's niece, she's still alive, isn't she?" I nodded. "Then it's not too late. You can still keep your promise, Danny. You can still do right by Jimmy." For the first time in over 30 years, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe Maria was right. Maybe it wasn't too late after all. 3 weeks later, when I was strong enough to travel, Maria and I drove to Boston together. It was a beautiful spring day, the kind of day that makes you grateful to be alive. As we pulled up in front of Catherine Murphy's modest 2-story house in Dorchester, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. "Are you ready?" Maria asked, squeezing my hand. I took a deep breath and nodded. "I've been ready for 32 years. Catherine Murphy was a woman in her early 50s, with greying hair and kind eyes that reminded me immediately of Jimmy. When I introduced myself and explained why I was there, she invited us in for coffee and listened with growing amazement as I told her about her uncle. "I barely remember him," she admitted. "I was only 7 when he died. But my father used to tell me stories about his little brother Jimmy, about how brave he was, how he always looked out for everyone else." "That sounds like the Jimmy I knew," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You said you have something that belonged to him." With trembling hands, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the letter I'd carried for over 3 decades. "He gave this to me just before he died. He made me promise to deliver it. I'm sorry it took me so long." Catherine took the envelope with reverence, turning it over in her hands. "It's addressed to K.O., she said, puzzled. "I always assumed it was for Kathleen," I said. "But now that she's gone—" Catherine was quiet for a moment, studying the envelope. Then her eyes widened. "K.O., she repeated. "Catherine O'Brien. That was my Aunt Kathleen's middle name, but it was also—" "Oh, my God." "What is it?" Maria asked. Catherine O'Brien was also the name of a girl my uncle was sweet on before the war. My father mentioned her once, said Jimmy was heartbroken when she married someone else while he was overseas. My heart sank. Another dead end, another person I'd failed to reach in time. But Catherine was smiling now, a strange, excited smile. "Mr. Benedetto, I think I know who this letter is for, and if I'm right, she's still alive." Catherine Murphy's words hit me like lightning. After 32 years of carrying this burden, after decades of believing I'd failed Jimmy completely, there was still hope. My hands were shaking as I watched her carefully open that yellowed envelope, the paper crackling with age. "Catherine O'Brien," Catherine said softly, unfolding the letter with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic. "She lives in a nursing home about 20 minutes from here. She's 91 years old now, but her mind is still sharp. I visit her sometimes because she was friends with my Aunt Kathleen." Maria reached over and squeezed my hand as Catherine began to read Jimmy's letter aloud. Her voice was gentle, respectful, as if she understood the weight of the moment. "My dearest Katie," she read, "if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home from France like I promised. I'm writing this on the night before we ship out for the invasion, and I need you to know something I should have told you years ago." Catherine paused, looking up at me with tears in her eyes. Should I continue? I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I never stopped loving you, Katie. I know you married Robert, and I know you have a life now that doesn't include me. But I couldn't go into battle without telling you that every day since you said goodbye has been a day I wished I could take back. Not because I regret serving my country, but because I regret not fighting harder for us. The words hung in the air like a prayer. After all these years, Jimmy's secret was finally being revealed, and it was exactly what I'd feared and hoped it would be. A love letter to a woman who'd gotten away. Catherine continued reading. I'm not writing this to cause you pain or to ask you to leave your husband. I'm writing this because a man should face death with honesty, and the honest truth is that you were the best thing that ever happened to me. If I don't come home, I want you to know that I died thinking of your smile, your laugh, the way you used to hum while you cooked Sunday dinner. I thought about Jimmy in that crater on Omaha Beach, how he'd clutched that letter like it was the most precious thing in the world. Now I understood why. There's something else you need to know, Katie. Something I found out just before we shipped out. Marie Dubois, the French girl I told you about in my last letter home. She's pregnant. The baby is mine. I know this complicates everything, and I know it probably hurts you to read this, but I couldn't die with this secret. Catherine stopped reading, her eyes wide with shock. There's more, she said quietly. If something happens to me, I've arranged for Marie to receive support from my army pay. But Katie, if you could find it in your heart to help her, to maybe write to her, I would be forever grateful. She's alone in a foreign country, carrying the child of a dead American soldier. She doesn't speak much English, but she's a good person, and she deserves better than what this war has given her. The letter went on for another page, but I was barely listening anymore. Jimmy had a child. A son or daughter who would be in their 70s now, probably with children and grandchildren of their own. An entire family that had grown up not knowing their American father, not knowing that he'd died a hero on a beach in Normandy. The letter is signed, "Forever yours, Jimmy," Catherine finished, folding the paper carefully. "Mr. Benedetto, do you realize what this means?" I nodded, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we'd discovered. Jimmy has descendants. A whole family in France that probably doesn't even know he existed. And Catherine O'Brien, Maria added softly. She's been carrying this secret for over 70 years, not knowing that Jimmy tried to reach out to her before he died. Catherine stood up, her face determined. We have to go see her. Today, right now. She deserves to know. The drive to the nursing home felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept thinking about Catherine O'Brien, this woman who'd loved Jimmy before the war, who'd married someone else while he was overseas, who'd spent the last 70-plus years not knowing that he'd died thinking of her. Sunset Manor was a pleasant enough place, with well-tended gardens and cheerful staff, but it still had that institutional smell that all nursing homes seem to have. Catherine led us through the corridors to a sunny room overlooking a small pond where an elderly woman sat in a wheelchair, reading a book. Catherine O'Brien was tiny, probably not even 5 feet tall, with silver hair and bright blue eyes that reminded me immediately of Jimmy. When Catherine introduced us and explained why we were there, those eyes filled with tears. "Jimmy O'Sullivan," she whispered, her voice still carrying traces of an Irish accent. "I haven't heard that name spoken aloud in decades." I sat down beside her and told her everything. About Jimmy, about D-Day, about the promise I'd made, and the letter I'd carried for 32 years. She listened without interruption, occasionally wiping tears from her cheeks. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "I married Robert 3 months after Jimmy shipped out," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was pregnant, you see, pregnant with Jimmy's child. But Jimmy never knew because I never told him. The room fell silent. Even the birds outside seemed to stop singing. "I was scared," Catherine continued. "It was 1943, and having a baby out of wedlock was, well, it would have ruined both our families. Robert was a good man, a kind man, and he offered to marry me and raise the baby as his own. I thought it was the right thing to do." "What happened to the baby?" Catherine asked gently. "Thomas," Catherine said, smiling through her tears. "Thomas O'Brien. He grew up thinking Robert was his father, and Robert was a wonderful father to him. But Thomas had Jimmy's eyes, Jimmy's smile, Jimmy's stubborn streak. I saw Jimmy in him every single day." "Is Thomas still alive?" I asked. "Oh, yes," Catherine said, her face lighting up. "He's 79 now, lives in California with his wife. He has 3 children and 7 grandchildren, Jimmy's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, though they don't know it." I felt like I was drowning in revelations. Jimmy hadn't just left behind one child in France, he'd left behind another child here in America, a son who'd grown up not knowing his real father's name. "There's something else," I said, pulling out the letter. "Jimmy wrote about a woman in France, Marie Dubois. She was pregnant too." Catherine's eyes widened. "Marie? He mentioned her in his letters. I was so jealous, so hurt. I thought he'd forgotten all about me." "He never forgot you," I said, handing her Jimmy's letter. "This proves it." Catherine read the letter with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. When she finished, she looked up at me with an expression of pure gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for keeping your promise. Thank you for bringing Jimmy back to me, even if it's 75 years too late." Over the next few months, Catherine Murphy and I worked together to piece together the rest of Jimmy's story. We hired genealogists and translators, reached out to French authorities, and slowly but surely tracked down Marie Dubois and her family. Marie had died in 1998, but she'd raised Jimmy's son, Pierre O'Sullivan, as a single mother in a small village in Normandy. Pierre was now 75 years old, a retired farmer with children and grandchildren of his own. When we finally made contact with him, he was overjoyed to learn about his American father. "I always wondered," he told us through a translator during our first phone call. "Mama would never talk about my father, would only say he was a good man who died in the war. I grew up knowing I was different, knowing there was something she wasn't telling me." 6 months later, Maria and I traveled to France to meet Pierre and his family. It was an emotional reunion, standing in that small village cemetery where Marie was buried, telling Pierre everything I knew about his father. He had Jimmy's eyes, Jimmy's stubborn chin, and when he smiled it was like seeing my old friend again. But the most incredible moment came when we arranged for Pierre to meet his half-brother Thomas via video call. 2 old men, separated by an ocean and a lifetime of secrets, finally learning they had a brother they'd never known existed. "Papa would be so proud," Pierre said in broken English, tears streaming down his weathered face. His sons finally together. Thomas flew to France the following month, and I was there when the 2 brothers met in person for the first time. They embraced like they'd known each other their whole lives, and I knew that Jimmy was finally at peace. As for Catherine O'Brien, she lived for another 2 years after receiving Jimmy's letter, long enough to meet both of Jimmy's sons and to tell them stories about their father that no one else could tell. She died peacefully in her sleep in 2009, at the age of 93, clutching Jimmy's letter to her chest. I'm 93 myself now, and I don't have much time left. But I can honestly say that keeping my promise to Jimmy, even though it took me 32 years to do it, was the most important thing I ever did. It taught me that some promises are worth a lifetime of waiting, that love doesn't die just because people do, and that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply tell the truth. Jimmy O'Sullivan died on a beach in France 79 years ago, but his legacy lives on in his children and great-grandchildren scattered across 2 continents. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, I like to think he's smiling that cocky Irish grin of his, finally knowing that his letter made it home. If you're listening to this story, and you have promises you've made, secrets you've kept, or words you've left unsaid, don't wait like I did. Don't let fear or shame or pride keep you from doing what's right. Because at the end of the day, when everything else fades away, the only thing that really matters is whether you kept faith with the people who trusted you. That's my story. That's my truth. And if it helps just one person find the courage to keep their own promise, then maybe all those years of carrying Jimmy's secret were worth it after all.